Welcome to this journey through one of the most extraordinary legal cases in American history, where the boundary between life and death, between the natural and supernatural, was tested in a court of law. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about justice, testimony, and the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of Appalachian mountains. We're about to delve into a case that defied all rational explanation, where a young woman named Zona Heaster Shue returned from beyond the grave to name her murderer, and left a legacy so profound that it remains the only known instance in United States legal history where testimony from a ghost helped secure a murder conviction. It was the year 1897. The nation was still healing from the wounds of the Civil War, entering a new age of industry and progress. Electric lights were beginning to illuminate city streets. The first automobiles were appearing on dusty roads. But in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, life moved according to older rhythms, governed by older laws written not in courtrooms, but in the whispering winds that moved through ancient hollows, in the collective memory of people who understood that some truths exist beyond what the eyes can see. The mountains themselves seemed to hold secrets. The Appalachian Range, ancient beyond human comprehension, stretched across the landscape like the spine of some sleeping giant. These were not the sharp, dramatic peaks of younger mountain ranges. No, these mountains were old, worn smooth by countless millennia, their slopes covered in dense forests of oak and hickory, pine and hemlock. Valleys carved deep into the earth created pockets of isolation where communities developed their own ways, their own beliefs, their own understanding of the world. In these mountains, the modern world arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself resisted change. Electricity was still a distant dream for most. Kerosene lamps provided light after darkness fell, which it did early in the winter months, the sun disappearing behind the ridges by mid-afternoon, leaving the valleys in premature twilight. Wood smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the scent of oak and hickory into the cold air. Roads were little more than muddy tracks that turned treacherous with rain or snow. But isolation did not mean ignorance. The people of Greenbrier County were educated in ways that textbooks could never capture. They understood the language of the land. They could read weather in the behavior of animals, predict harsh winters by the thickness of walnut shells, find water by the feel of willow branches pulling toward hidden springs. And they understood that death was not always the end, that sometimes, when justice was denied, when terrible wrongs went unpunished, the dead found ways to speak. Greenbrier County lay in the southeastern corner of West Virginia, a land of contradictions and extremes. The Greenbrier River, for which the county was named, wound through valleys like a silver thread, sometimes peaceful and clear, sometimes swollen with rain, dangerous and unpredictable. The county seat, Lewisburg, was a town of perhaps 2,000 souls, its brick buildings and courthouse representing civilization's foothold in the wilderness. But it was not in Lewisburg where our story begins. It was in the smaller communities scattered throughout the county, places with names like Livesey's Mill and Richlands, where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputation mattered more than wealth, and where a person's word was their bond. The winter of 1896 moved into 1897 with particular harshness. Snow fell heavy and stayed late. The ground froze solid. Streams that usually ran clear turned sluggish with ice. It was the kind of winter that made people draw close to their fires, that made them grateful for stored food and preserved meat, that made the nights seem longer and darker than usual. In this world lived Mary Jane Robinson Heaster, a woman whose face bore the lines of hard living, but whose eyes held fierce determination. She was a mother who had buried children, a wife who had known loss, a woman shaped by the unforgiving reality of mountain life. She lived near Livesey's mill with her husband, Jacob, in a modest home that had sheltered her family through decades of seasons. Mary Jane had given birth to several children, but by 1897, her daughter Elva Zona Heaster, known simply as Zona, was one of her greatest joys. Zona was 3 years old, with dark hair and a quick smile that could light up a room. She was small in stature, but strong in spirit, known throughout the community for her energy and her laughter. Young men noticed her, women enjoyed her company. She seemed destined for a normal, happy life, marriage, children, the simple satisfactions of mountain existence. But Zona was also headstrong, possessed of an independence that sometimes worried her mother. She had been married once before, briefly, a union that had ended in separation. In the tight-knit communities of Greenbrier County, this was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Divorced women faced whispers and sideways glances. Zona bore this with the same determination that characterized everything she did. Then, in the autumn of 1896, a stranger arrived in the area. His name was Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, though he went by Edward or Trout. He was a drifter, a blacksmith by trade, a man who had lived in various places and seemed to have no deep roots anywhere. He was handsome in a rough way, with strong arms from working at the forge, dark hair, and a manner that could be charming when he chose. He found work shoeing horses and repairing tools, skills always in demand in agricultural communities. Zona met him. What passed between them, what attraction sparked, what promises were made, these details are lost to time. But in October of 1896, despite her mother's reservations, despite the fact that little was known about this stranger's past, Zona married Edward Shue. Mary Jane Heaster did not approve. She would later say that from the first moment she met Edward Shue, something felt wrong. Not wrong in any way, she could articulate clearly no specific action or word she could point to. It was something deeper, more instinctive. The way he looked at Zona, the way he controlled conversations, the way he seemed to have answers prepared for questions before they were asked. But Zona was in love, or believed she was, and 3 years old, and determined to make her own choices. She moved into a small house with her new husband near Livesey's mill, not far from her mother's home, but far enough to establish her own household, her own life. The autumn passed, winter came. Neighbors would later report that they sometimes heard raised voices from the Shue house, that Edward seemed to have a temper, that Zona appeared less cheerful than she had been, more withdrawn. But domestic disputes were considered private matters. People did not interfere, and Zona, when asked, always smiled and said everything was fine. Everything was not fine. On the morning of January 23, 1897, a young boy named Andy Jones was given an errand by Edward Shue. Andy was perhaps 11 years old, the son of a neighboring family, sometimes hired to do odd jobs. Edward asked him to go to the Shue house and ask Zona if she needed anything from town, as Edward would be working at the blacksmith shop all day. It was a cold morning. Frost covered everything. The boy's breath formed clouds in the air as he walked the short distance to the house. He knocked on the door, no answer. He knocked again, louder, still nothing. The door was unlocked, most doors were, in those days and in that place. So he pushed it open and called out, "Mrs. Shue, Mrs. Shue, are you home?" Silence answered him. He stepped inside. The house was dim, curtains drawn against the winter light. Cold, the fire had gone out, leaving the rooms frigid. The boy moved through the front room into the hallway, and then he saw her. Zona lay at the bottom of the stairs. She was on her back, one arm stretched above her head, the other at her side. Her legs were straight, feet together. Her eyes were closed. She appeared to be sleeping, except for the absolute stillness, the complete absence of breath or movement. The boy ran. He ran faster than he had ever run before, his heart hammering, his mind barely processing what he had seen. He ran to his mother, gasping out his discovery. She sent him immediately to fetch the doctor while she went to investigate herself. Dr. George W. Knapp was the local physician, a man educated in the medical sciences of the time, but also familiar with the practical realities of mountain doctoring. He had set bones, delivered babies, treated fevers and infections with the limited tools available. He had also examined his share of bodies, signed death certificates, performed the basic duties required when death came to the community. He arrived at the Shue house within the hour, accompanied by Mrs. Jones, and soon joined by Edward Shue himself, who had been summoned from his workplace with news that his wife had been found dead. What Dr. Knapp observed would become crucial to everything that followed. When he entered the house, Edward Shue was already there, cradling Zona's body. He had moved her from the bottom of the stairs to the bed upstairs. He had dressed her in her best dress, a high-necked dress with a stiff collar. Around her neck he had wrapped a scarf tied tight. He was beside her, weeping openly, his grief apparently overwhelming. Dr. Knapp attempted to examine the body. Edward would not leave the room. He hovered over his wife's body, his presence making a thorough examination difficult. When Knapp attempted to check Zona's neck, the most likely site of injury from a fall downstairs, Edward became agitated. "Don't move her," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, don't disturb her. She's at peace now." The scarf remained in place. Edward kept one hand on Zona's head, gently moving it back and forth, a gesture that might have seemed tender, but had the effect of preventing Knapp from properly examining the neck area. Dr. Knapp was troubled, but social conventions of the time made it difficult to override a grieving husband's wishes. He made a cursory examination. He found no obvious signs of violence beyond what might be consistent with a fall. The body was still somewhat warm, suggesting death had occurred not long before discovery. He noticed some slight discoloration around the neck, but couldn't examine it properly because of the scarf and Edward's interference. Under pressure, aware that Edward was growing more agitated with each passing moment, Dr. Knapp made a decision he would later regret. He signed a death certificate listing the cause of death as everlasting faint, a vague term that might indicate a heart condition or stroke. Later, pressured by questions, he would change this to complications from pregnancy, though Zona had shown no signs of being pregnant. The body was prepared for burial. In that time and place, bodies were not embalmed unless being transported long distances. They were dressed, laid out at home, watched over by family and community members until burial, which typically occurred within a day or two of death. Edward Shue took control of these preparations with unusual intensity. He dressed Zona himself, allowing no one else to touch her. He placed a pillow on one side of her head, bundled fabric on the other, effectively preventing anyone from moving her head or touching her neck. He kept the high collar in place, added the scarf, and placed a veil over her face. When women from the community came to help with the laying out, as was traditional, as was expected, Edward turned them away or hovered so close that they could do nothing. This was strange, highly unusual. In Appalachian mountain communities, death rituals were communal affairs. The women prepared bodies, they sat vigil, they prayed and sang hymns. For a husband to exclude them entirely violated deeply held customs. Mary Jane Heaster arrived to view her daughter's body. She approached the coffin, looked down at Zona's face through the veil, and felt the wrongness of it settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The position of the body, the excessive clothing around the neck, the way Edward stood guard, his eyes red from crying but also watchful, vigilant, as if protecting something. She reached out to touch her daughter's hand. It was cold, completely cold. Zona had been dead for hours, despite Edward's claim that he had left her alive and well that morning. The funeral was held. The burial took place in a cemetery near the church. Edward wept throughout, his grief on full display. People whispered. Some felt sympathy for the young widower. Others felt something else, an unease they couldn't quite name. Mary Jane Heaster felt no sympathy. She felt fury. In the days following Zona's burial, Mary Jane did what mountain women had done for generations when they sought answers beyond what the physical world could provide. She prayed, not the casual prayers of Sunday service, but deep, intense prayers that came from the core of her being. She prayed for truth. She prayed for justice. She prayed for her daughter's voice to be heard. And then, on a night when the wind howled through the hollows and the temperature dropped below freezing, Zona came to her. Mary Jane would later testify under oath about what happened. She was in her bed, not quite asleep but not fully awake, in that liminal space where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The room grew cold, colder than the winter night could account for. A presence filled the space, and there was Zona. Not as she had appeared in the coffin, dressed in funeral clothes with her neck concealed. Zona appeared as she had been in life, wearing a dress Mary Jane recognized, her face clear and unmarked. But there was a sadness in her eyes, a weight of knowledge that the living Zona had never carried. "Mama," the apparition said, her voice carrying the texture of wind through trees, of water over stones, of everything natural and nothing human. "Mama, I need you to know the truth." Mary Jane wanted to speak, but found she could not. She could only listen, paralyzed by awe and terror and desperate love. Zona's ghost turned her head. Slowly, impossibly, she turned it far beyond what any living person could manage turned it, until it faced completely backward, demonstrating with horrifying clarity what had been done to her. "He killed me, Mama. Edward killed me. He broke my neck because he thought I hadn't cooked meat for his supper. He broke my neck in a fit of rage, and then he moved my body, dressed me, hid the evidence of what he'd done." The apparition turned her head back to its normal position, and in that moment Mary Jane could see the bruising around the neck, the marks of violent hands, the damage that the high collar and scarf had been designed to hide. "He must be brought to justice, Mama. He must be stopped. He's done this before. He will do it again. Please, Mama. Promise me you'll see this through." Mary Jane tried to speak, tried to promise, tried to reach out. But the apparition was already fading, the cold receding, the presence withdrawing like mist burning off at sunrise. She woke fully, if she had ever truly been asleep. Her heart hammered. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat despite the cold room. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her daughter had spoken to her. The visitation repeated itself over the next 3 nights. Each time Zona appeared. Each time she showed her mother the broken neck. Each time she insisted that Edward had murdered her, that he had done this deliberately, that justice must be served. On the 4th night, Zona did not come, but Mary Jane no longer needed more convincing. She rose with the dawn and went directly to the local prosecutor. His name was John Alfred Preston, a respected attorney who served as the Greenbrier County prosecutor. He was a practical man, educated in the law, not given to flights of fancy or superstitious beliefs. When Mary Jane Heaster appeared in his office and began to tell her story, He listened with the polite skepticism of someone humoring a grief-stricken mother. "Mrs. Heaster," he began carefully, "I understand that you've lost your daughter under tragic circumstances, and I'm deeply sorry for your loss. But what you're describing is the truth." Mary Jane interrupted, her voice firm. "My daughter came to me. She showed me what was done to her. She named her killer." Preston considered this. In another time, in another place, such a claim might have resulted in immediate dismissal, perhaps even concerns about the woman's mental state. But this was Greenbrier County in 1897. This was Appalachia, where the old beliefs still held power, where many people accepted that the supernatural and natural worlds intersected more often than educated city dwellers might admit. More importantly, Preston was aware of the unusual circumstances surrounding Zona's death and burial. Dr. Knapp had expressed his own doubts about his initial diagnosis. The community gossip had noted Edward Shue's strange behavior. There were questions that needed answers. "Tell me everything," Preston said. Mary Jane did. She described the visitations in detail, Zona's appearance, her words, the demonstration of the broken neck, the accusations against Edward. She described her own certainty that her daughter had been murdered. Preston listened. Then he made a decision that would change legal history. "I'll look into this," he told her. "I'll speak with Dr. Knapp. I'll investigate Mr. Shue's background, and if there's sufficient cause, I'll recommend an exhumation and proper autopsy." Mary Jane left his office with her head held high. Her daughter would have justice. Preston moved quickly. He spoke with Dr. Knapp, who admitted his examination had been insufficient, that Edward Shue's behavior had been highly suspicious, that he had concerns about the death from the beginning. Preston spoke with neighbors, who reported the arguments they had heard, the changes they had observed in Zona after her marriage, the controlling behavior Edward exhibited. Then Preston began investigating Edward Shue's past, sending inquiries to other counties, other states. What came back chilled him to his core. Edward Shue had been married twice before. His first wife had divorced him, citing cruelty. His second wife had died under mysterious circumstances. She had fallen and broken her neck. The authorities in that jurisdiction had ruled it an accident, but there had been questions, whispers, suspicions that were never formally investigated. A pattern emerged, a disturbing, unmistakable pattern. Preston went before a judge and requested permission for exhumation and autopsy. The request was granted. On February 22, 1898, 1 month and a day after Zona's death, her body was removed from the grave. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Knapp along with 2 other physicians. What they found left no room for doubt. Zona's neck had been broken. The windpipe had been crushed. There were clear finger marks on her throat, bruising consistent with manual strangulation. Her neck had been dislocated between the first and second vertebrae, with such force that the spinal cord had been severed. This was no accident. This was no fall down the stairs. This was murder, brutal, violent, deliberate murder. Edward Shue was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The trial began in June of 1897 at the Greenbrier County Courthouse in Lewisburg. The courthouse itself was an imposing brick building with tall windows, and a courtroom designed to convey the gravity and majesty of the law. Outside, the summer sun beat down on the Green Mountains. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the weight of impending judgment. The case drew enormous attention. Newspapers from across the state and beyond sent reporters. The courtroom was packed each day with spectators who arrived hours early to secure seats. Some came out of genuine interest in justice. Others came for the spectacle, drawn by rumors that a ghost would testify. Edward Shue sat at the defense table, dressed in his best clothes, his expression carefully composed. He had secured legal representation. A capable defense attorney who knew he faced an uphill battle, but was determined to mount the best defense possible. The prosecution, led by John Preston, presented its case methodically and powerfully. First came the medical evidence. Dr. Knapp took the stand and admitted his initial failure to conduct a proper examination. He described Edward's interference, the strange positioning of the body, the excessive clothing around the neck. Then he described the findings of the autopsy in precise, clinical detail: the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, the finger marks on the throat. In your professional medical opinion, Dr. Knapp, could these injuries have resulted from a fall downstairs? No, sir, absolutely not. The injuries are entirely consistent with manual strangulation and deliberate breaking of the neck. This young woman was murdered. The defense attorney cross-examined vigorously, trying to suggest that the body's deterioration over the month between death and autopsy might have created false evidence, that the examination was flawed, but Dr. Knapp held firm, supported by the two other physicians who had assisted with the autopsy. Next came testimony about Edward's behavior, his control over the body, his exclusion of the women who traditionally would have prepared it, his excessive grief that some witnesses described as performative rather than genuine. The prosecution introduced evidence of Edward's previous marriages over defense objections. The judge allowed it as establishing pattern and motive. The courtroom stirred when the jury learned that Edward had been married twice before, that his second wife had also died of a broken neck. Witnesses described the arguments neighbors had heard from the Shue house. One woman testified that she had seen Zona with bruises on her arms 2 weeks before her death, bruises that Zona had tried to hide beneath long sleeves. The case was building powerfully, but everyone knew the most controversial testimony was yet to come. On the third day of the trial, Mary Jane Heaster took the stand. She was a simple mountain woman, dressed in her Sunday best, her face lined with grief, but her eyes fierce with determination. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The defense attorney objected immediately to her testimony, arguing that anything she had learned through supernatural means was inadmissible. The judge, understanding the delicate nature of what was to come, overruled the objection, but instructed Preston to proceed carefully. Preston asked Mary Jane to describe her relationship with her daughter, their closeness, her concerns about Edward. He established her as a credible witness, a loving mother who had no reason to fabricate evidence against her son-in-law. Then he asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. Mrs. Heaster, after your daughter's death and burial, did anything unusual occur? Mary Jane took a deep breath. Yes, sir, my daughter came to me. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The judge called for order. Please describe what you experienced. Mary Jane did. She described the visitations over 4 nights. She described Zona's appearance, her words, the demonstration of the broken neck. She spoke with absolute conviction, her voice never wavering, her certainty unshakable. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. He tried to suggest delusion, grief, induced hallucination, even fraud. Mary Jane remained unshaken. Sir, she said at one point, her voice cutting through his questions like a blade, I know what I saw. I know what my daughter told me. You can believe me or not, but I spoke the truth under oath before God, and I'll not be shaken from it. The courtroom was silent. Even those who might have been skeptical found themselves moved by her absolute certainty. But here was the crucial element. the ghost's testimony was not, technically, what convicted Edward Shue. The ghost's testimony had led to the exhumation and autopsy. It was the medical evidence, the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, the finger marks, that provided the legal basis for conviction. The supernatural elements had pointed the way to natural, physical evidence that could be examined, verified, and presented in court. The prosecution rested its case. The defense attorney called Edward Shue to testify in his own defense, a risky move, but necessary given the strength of the prosecution's case. Edward took the stand and denied everything. He claimed to have loved his wife. He said she had been ill with some undefined condition, that she had been prone to fainting spells. He suggested she had fallen down the stairs during one such spell. He explained his behavior at her deathbed as the actions of a grieving husband who couldn't bear to have strangers touching his beloved wife's body. His testimony was smooth, practiced, but under cross-examination, cracks appeared. Preston pressed him about his previous marriages. Edward became evasive. Preston asked about the bruises witnesses had seen on Zona's arms. Edward claimed ignorance. Preston asked him to explain how a fall downstairs could produce the specific pattern of injuries found during the autopsy. Edward couldn't. His explanations grew more convoluted, more desperate. His composure cracked. At one point, faced with a particularly pointed question, his temper flared just for a moment, just long enough for the jury to see the rage that lurked beneath the surface. The trial lasted a week. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Edward Shue was sentenced to life in prison at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, noted the overwhelming evidence of guilt, the clear premeditation, and the calculated attempts to conceal the crime. Edward served his sentence without incident, dying in prison in 1900 and, according to records, maintaining his innocence until the end. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. He took whatever additional secrets he might have held to his grave. The story of Zona Heaster Shue remains unique in American legal history. It stands as the only documented case where testimony obtained through alleged supernatural means led directly to a murder investigation, exhumation, autopsy, and subsequent conviction. Legal scholars have studied the case for generations, fascinated by its implications. The ghost's testimony was not, strictly speaking, what convicted Edward Shue. That honor belongs to the medical evidence discovered during the autopsy. But without Mary Jane Heaster's insistence driven by her daughter's alleged appearances, that autopsy would never have occurred. The murder would have remained undiscovered. Edward Shue would have walked free, perhaps to kill again. Did Zona's ghost really appear to her mother? Or did Mary Jane's deep maternal instinct, her awareness of her daughter's unhappiness, her observation of Edward's suspicious behavior, manifest itself in the only form that could give her the courage and conviction to challenge the authorities and demand justice? We cannot know. The truth lies somewhere in the space between rational explanation and supernatural mystery, in that liminal realm where the Appalachian Mountains have always existed, a place where the old ways of knowing carry as much weight as scientific evidence, where intuition and fact interweave, where the dead do not always rest quietly when their murders go unpunished. What we do know is that Mary Jane Heaster refused to accept the official version of events. She refused to let her daughter's death be dismissed as natural causes or accident. She pursued justice with a determination that overcame every social and legal obstacle. Whether guided by ghostly visitation or maternal instinct, she ensured that her daughter's murderer faced judgment. The case changed how some authorities approached suspicious deaths. It reinforced the importance of thorough autopsies and proper death investigations. It demonstrated that justice could be served even when the path to it followed unexpected routes. In Greenbrier County, the story has never been forgotten. The highway marker stands today near the site where Zona lived and died, commemorating the Greenbrier Ghost, and ensuring that her story remains part of the historical record. The case is taught in local schools. Tour guides tell visitors about the young woman who came back from the dead to name her killer. But questions remain. They always do in cases like this. Did Edward Shue kill his second wife as well? Were there others before her? What darkness lived inside a man who could murder his wife over something as trivial as an unapproved meal, who could then methodically dress her body and stage the scene, who could weep convincingly at her funeral while knowing full well what he had done? To this day, people in Greenbrier County report unusual experiences near the old cemetery where Zona is buried. Some claim to see a figure in period dress walking among the headstones at twilight. Others report feelings of overwhelming sadness near her grave, or the sensation of being watched, or whispers carried on the wind that sound like a woman's voice saying a single word, "Remember." Whether these are true supernatural manifestations or the power of suggestion working on minds primed by history, they serve a purpose. They ensure that Zona Heaster Shue is not forgotten. They ensure that her story continues to be told. They ensure that justice, once served, remains served. And perhaps that's the real power of ghost stories, of the supernatural tales that emerge from places like Appalachia. They're not really about ghosts at all. They're about memory. They're about justice. They're about refusing to let the dead be forgotten, especially those who died violently, wrongly, at the hands of people who should have protected them. The Greenbrier Ghost is not a story about the supernatural overcoming the natural. It's a story about a mother's love proving stronger than death. It's about a woman finding the courage to challenge authority, to demand investigation, to pursue truth even when that truth arrived through unconventional means. It's about a daughter's voice being heard, one way or another, even from beyond the grave. The mountains of Appalachia hold many secrets. Some are buried so deep they'll never be uncovered. Others, like the story of Zona Heaster Shue, emerge into the light because someone refused to let them remain hidden. If this journey through one of history's most extraordinary legal cases has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of justice and the mysteries that exist beyond our understanding, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, voices from the past that still have something to say to the present. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it made you think about how justice can take unexpected forms, how truth can emerge through unlikely channels, how love can transcend even the boundary of death itself. Comment below sharing your own thoughts on this case. Do you believe Mary Jane truly received visitations from her daughter's spirit? Or do you think her maternal instinct and observations manifested in a form that gave her the strength to pursue justice? Is there any real difference between those two explanations? Until next time, remember that history is not just what's written in official records. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that come to us through different channels, through stories told around fires, through warnings whispered from one generation to the next, through the persistent voices of those who refuse to be silenced, even by death itself. The dead do speak, if we're willing to listen.